appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
The President of the United States is dead.
Considering the number of enemies that he had, Lord knows they had reasons to get rid of him.
And I know that her face is down like this. She pushed him down and crawled out over the back to get a piece of skull off the back of the car.
Turned out that he left his tape recorder going when he left the room.
That bullet then traversed and moved backward. And then you do have a shot from the rear that struck him in the back, and I think there was another shot that hit him in the back of the head.
It didn't make any sense why one guy who suddenly went from having fired a rifle since the Marine Corps and suddenly was able to pull off world-class precision.
Was there a real thread of that fear running through the administration that perhaps a coup could take place?
He and Kenny O'Donnell were told they had to change their stories for the good of the country. He had to basically lie about what he saw.
Showtime. Welcome to the show. I'm Brent Holland. Get in your most comfy chair, get the coffee going, get the tea going, get a beverage of choice going, kick your feet back, take this time for yourself. It's blustery out there. We're in the middle of winter, and it's a good time to sit back and take this time for yourself. Our guest tonight is the legendary Dick Russell, investigative author. His groundbreaking book, The Man Who Knew Too Much, Hired to Kill Oswald and Prevent the Assassination of JFK, Richard Case Nagel. Now, this book, folks, I have to tell you, I read from cover to cover before I got into the JFK assassination as a host. This is going back to the 90s, and it is literally a staple in the JFK community. Just as a note, if you've seen the masterpiece film by Oliver Stone, JFK, you've seen the character portrayed by Sutherland, Man X. Now, Man X is a composite of two people, real-life people. One of them, of course, is Colonel Fletcher Prouty, and the other is based on Richard Case Nagel. Some trivia for you. Dick is the author of 16 nonfiction books, including 3 New York Times bestsellers, co-authored with Jesse Ventura, and Jesse's been on the show, as you know, fans of the show, and 3 books on the JFK assassination, as well as Eye of the Whale, which was named among the best books of the year by 3 major newspapers in 2001. He is author of The Real RFK Jr., which we're going to be discussing tonight. He's also working on a new book on the UFO phenomenon, and when that comes out, we will certainly talk, absolutely without question. Let me read this from the foreword from Dick's book, The Real JFK Jr. It would be difficult for you to have lived in America and not have a negative picture of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. You may recall him as the country's leading champion of the environment for most of his adult life, but this has been obfuscated in recent years by the mass media's labeling of him as an anti-vaxxer and peddler of misinformation. The story of a robust leader who has overcome personal tragedy to become a tireless warrior for justice, justice for children, justice for every ethnicity, for the evaporating middle class, and for both Republicans and Democrats. Dick, I had a question all lined up for you, but I'm going to throw that away as well as the script, so to speak. Now, straight out of the box, Dick, what is it you want to get across about RFK Jr.?
Well, I think mainly, I've known Bobby for more than 20 years, and we've worked together on environmental projects and other projects over the years and become better and better friends. So I didn't set out to write a campaign biography, but I was very disturbed, deeply disturbed by the big media's portrayal of him as this kind of crazy anti-vaxxer, conspiracy theorist who was going to, make up all this stuff and lead people astray. That's crazy. And the mass media's portrayal of him led me to think there really should be. There'd been a couple of books about him in the past, but nothing that really got into who he is and the depth of character that he has and why he's so devoted to preserving our environment and also our public health for the future. So we sat down week after week at his home in Los Angeles, and where I also live, and we'd meet and talk about various aspects of his life. And he didn't want to avoid the difficult parts and painful parts, which have been are the making of him, actually, in the sense that he was, after his father was killed in 1968, his uncle, of course, before him. Bobby was 14 years old, and you can imagine what it was like for a kid to go through that. His father was about to probably become president of the United States. All of a sudden, he was gone, and so he. It was the late 1960s, and he was a young rebel and became a heroin addict, actually, for a good bit of time. And when we sat down to talk about doing the book, he said, I don't want to just shove that aside. He was, after it took a long time, he was 29 years old when he suddenly got busted, actually, on a plane and taken into by the police, and then he ended up in a rehab center for a good while, and that's what got him into the environment. I mean, he said, he's been sober ever since. He still goes to AA meetings, and had me come with him to one of those to witness, a speech that he was giving to the guys there, and he's just helped so many people overcome their addiction problems. So that's certainly one thing, an aspect of the book that I wanted to get across.
Down to earth guy.
Pardon?
Down to earth guy, unpretentious.
Yes, very down to earth, and still a big nature lover, and we took a hike occasionally up this big mountain, and he's in great shape. I mean, he's 70 years old, so he's a little bit younger than me, but he goes to the gym, he works out, and he puts his money where his mouth is in that regard.
Trick I found out, Dick, when they're younger than you, or if they're in better shape than you and you're hiking, kick them in the shins. It tends to slow them down.
I'll try that next time.
Okay. Dick, what did the Democratic Party, let's unravel all this mystery about RFK. What did the Democratic Party do to RFK Jr.?
Well, he came in to running for president. He told me several months before he did it, which was a little more than 2 years ago now. And he said, we were sitting out at his house, and the biography had not come out yet, but it was in the final stages. And he said, I think I'm going to have to run for president. And he said, I just don't see anybody who can heal or try to heal the terrible divide in this country between, everybody, Republicans and Democrats. But, it was just nobody could even talk to each other anymore. And so he felt called to do that, and he entered the race as a Democrat because he's been a Democrat all his life, and his uncle and his father were great Democratic leaders, of course. But the Democratic Party just didn't want anything to do with him. They didn't really run a legitimate campaign. I mean, they kept him out of the primaries, made it extremely difficult for him to, get his name on the ballot in different states. I mean, they tried all kinds of things, savaged him in the media. Because they were going to.
What forces in the Democratic Party do you feel were behind that movement?
The Democratic National Committee, especially, and of course, President Biden was going along with it because at that point in time he was going to be the nominee again, and there just wasn't a fair or real process. So he went with that for a long time, and then he said, I'm going to quit the Democratic Party and I'm going to run as an independent, because I feel like I could still perhaps even win as an independent. Nobody had ever done that. Ross Perot, I think, got more votes than anybody back in '92 as an independent candidate. And he was polling right out of the box at pretty high. I mean, 15, 20%. So he hung in there. I was with him. He was actually considering Jesse Ventura for vice president to join him, and they had a meeting about this in Tucson, Arizona, and I'm still very close to Jesse. I wrote several books with him, so I was there in the room when Bobby actually offered him that possibility.
How did
And
Jesse respond?
it was really amazing to see. What happened, what was, and I haven't really told this story very often. Um, First, Jesse said, well, I'd have to think about it because I'm in my early 70s now. I've got some health problems and my wife has her problems. So I'd really have to consider it. And then he stopped for a minute and he said, but then I think of what your uncle said.
Hmm.
Ask not what you can do for your country. And he burst into tears.
Jeez.
It was truly something to see. And Bobby just sat across from him and said, comforted him basically, and said, "It's okay, Jesse. It's okay." And I'll tell you, I'll never forget that moment. It was just the three of us in the room, and so that was a possibility. And then and Jesse actually got permission from his wife to go ahead and accept this, but at that point, things had moved on, and Bobby ended up choosing Nicole Shanahan, who also had, frankly, a lot of money to contribute to the campaign and was very devoted to the campaign in other ways too, to be his vice president. But he needed that kind of support as well. So I didn't blame him for it. I think Jesse was hurt by it. And then take us up to, this past summer, I guess, when to a lot of people's surprise, including mine, Bobby decided that he'd had a number of conversations with Donald Trump. I stayed away from the campaign in the sense of a direct involvement. I mean, I'm a writer. I just, was more effective, I think, sort of supporting him from the outside. And so I wasn't at these meetings that he had with Donald Trump. And I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, never have been. And he wasn't either. I mean, he wrote the foreword to a couple of books I did on climate change, Horsemen of the Apocalypse and Climate in Crisis, and just savaged what Trump was going to do to the environment back in 2016. But, nobody in the Democratic Party was giving him a chance to be considered for a position. And Trump was open to it, and indeed open to it in terms of the public health field that Bobby had been devoting himself to for a number of years, because more than 50% of Americans have chronic disease now.
I know.
I mean, we're one of the least healthy, certainly one of the least healthy Western nations in the world. And he took that up and he stuck with it all through COVID, and calling for other treatments that might be just as effective, if not more so, than the vaccines. He lived with being called anti-vax, which he's not. He's always spoken of the need for safe vaccines that need to be tested against a placebo before we give them to our kids, especially. So Donald Trump said he'd give him a chance, and
what were your feelings on that? That was a momentous decision, and I know it almost went nuclear in the JFK community, because the JFK community pretty much is democratic, I would say.
Sure.
And
Yeah, me too.
all of a sudden he's siding with Donald Trump, who is seen as a nemesis, if you will, and certainly not a popular figure in any sense for most liberal thinking people. And now you've got one of the most liberal thinking people siding with Donald Trump. I think it was a smart move, and I'm going to catch hell for this. And I'll tell you why. Because I feel that was the only way he could be in service to the country the way he wanted to be in service to the country, because the Democratic Party had just shut this guy down. What are your perspectives?
I think you're absolutely right about that. I mean, I wrote him the night before when it was unclear that he was actually going to make this decision, and I said, I really hope you don't do it. I sent him an email. But he did, and it was a strange thing. I'll never forget that day. I was watching it with a young lady who I've known all her life, and she's a legal advisor to the super PAC that was run by my publisher, Tony Lyons, and Bobby's publisher too, at Skyhorse. And we walked outside afterwards, and it felt like the whole world had shifted. Something huge had happened in the universe. I mean, it was, I don't know.
Yeah, it was monumental.
It was,
Yeah.
and I think absolutely he felt this is how the only way that I can. He tried to talk to Kamala Harris.
Mhm.
He would have certainly preferred to, get some position in the Democratic Party, I think. And I didn't honestly trust that Trump was going to come through on his promise because often he has not in the past. And yet he did. And he named Bobby as Cabinet Secretary for Health and Human Services.
Is that a good role for him to play?
It absolutely is at this point. I mean, it could have, been EPA because he knows a lot about the environment too.
That's what I was thinking as well. Yeah.
But he's been deeply involved in the public health crisis that we have in this country, and in not just this is not about vaccines. I mean, this is about what people take into their bodies and what kind of food we eat,
Yep.
and what preservatives are in our food, and he's devoted to doing something about that. And Trump has appointed officials to the agencies that fall under HHS, Health and Human Services, like the
Mhm.
FDA, Food and Drug Administration, the NIH, National Institutes of Health, that scare a lot of the big media pundits and Democrats. But in fact, these are people that Bobby Kennedy's been allied with, through the COVID fight, with the guy who opposed the lockdowns, which I got to say, I think the lockdowns were a big mistake, and they affected our kids' health detrimentally, mental health and other
Yes,
things.
especially. Yeah.
Yeah,
Especially.
and their social relationships, and
Yeah.
so most of the appointments in that regard that President Trump has made um, seem like they're in sync with who Bobby Kennedy is and what he's going to try to do. I don't think that's true of all of Trump's appointments across the board, but I certainly think in this particular, and Health and Human Services is the biggest agency in the federal government. I mean, he's right now out there having to appoint 2,000 people to jobs, run a $1.7 trillion agency, which is 30% of the federal government budget. It's pretty amazing what he's having to go through to learn the ropes about that, as well as face this confirmation hearing that he'll be up against in January, which I really hope he gets through. And there's a grassroots campaign going on to try to educate people about that.
Let's talk about the vaccine thing, because he got this horrible reputation during the COVID crisis that he was an anti-vaxxer. Nothing's further from the truth. He is not an anti-vaxxer. I want to make that clear. Could you unpack that for us, please, Dick?
He got into this very reluctantly, this whole
Mhm.
public health world, back in 2005, I think it was. I write about it at some length in the Real RFK Jr. And it happened when a woman came to his door, actually, who had an autistic son. He'd been speaking about mercury in the environment, in power plants, all over the place. And he began to see that there were all these women showing up and sitting in the front row, and afterwards coming up to him and saying, what you're saying is all true, but you really should look at the impact of mercury in vaccines, which at the time, thimerosal was a preservative used in childhood vaccines that was, I think, causing a lot of autism in children. And the media says it's always been disproved, but back in that period, I mean, it was pretty serious. And yeah, there are other factors that are contributing to autism, no doubt, but for some reason, environmental factors, partly vaccines, we don't really know because they've never looked into it. There's an increase of autism rates in our country where it's now 1 in 30 kids,
Usually
1 in 20
male.
some boys.
I have two godsons who are autistic, different
Wow.
levels. Yeah. So it's epidemic. I don't know. Maybe it's uh, being diagnosed better. I'm uncertain, but certainly,
Yes, it is
yeah,
unclear, but I think he would, begin to emphasize the need for testing of these
exactly.
things,
Yeah.
which frankly the National Institutes of Health was not willing to do. And in his book, The Real Anthony Fauci,
Hmm.
uh, Bobby really pointed out some very unpleasant truths about Dr. Fauci, who of course was America's, great God doctor through the COVID pandemic. Um, but there's a dark side, and he's been. I mean, the pharmaceutical industry
Yeah.
is the biggest lobbying force in America, and Bobby took them on, and that's a big corporate capture, which is the big thing he talks about, agency capture by corporations, and a revolving door that moves between agencies like NIH and the pharmaceutical industry and the environmental organizations, or the EPA and the chemical companies. I mean, this has been going on for a long time, and he's been talking about it for 20 some years. So I think it'd be great if we get pharma ads off TV, which were never allowed, until the mid 1980s. Now that's all you see on the news.
Yeah.
So of course,
And
that's a
gambling.
big, the news isn't going to really look into the pharmaceutical industry because they're getting all this money from them. And but that only two countries allow pharma ads on TV, and it's the US and New Zealand. That's an interesting fact. So I think
I
he
didn't
would
know
get,
about New Zealand.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think he'd get rid of
Interesting.
that. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Before we run out of time, I'd like to, he's been named as a conspiracy nut, as we all have. We all carry that title. He is the only Kennedy that I know of, besides maybe John Kennedy Jr., to come forward with an investigation, if you will, with a question mark about not only his father's death, but his uncle's death, John F. Kennedy Jr. And for that, again, the media has jumped all over him. Now, both you and I have studied both assassinations in depth, and we know that there's so many anomalies to these things. Like, for example, folks, in Bobby Kennedy's assassination, 14 bullets from a gun that holds 8. How's that happen? Bobby was shot less than 2 inches from behind his right ear. And Sirhan was never behind Bobby. Never mind, never behind Bobby, but never closer than 3 or 4 feet.
never hit him.
Never him. So let's unpack that a little bit too, if you don't mind, before we run out of time. How do you feel about all this?
Yeah, well, it's something that for years I never talked to Bobby about the fact I'd written not just The Man Who Knew Too Much, but several books on his uncle's assassination, and I also knew a lot about his father's assassination. But I felt, he wasn't really part of our relationship. We were working on environmental things. I didn't really want anything from him about it.
Yeah, how do
And
you bring
so,
that up, right?
yeah, it was a painful subject, and for years he would not go near it. But I think it was around 2008 or 9, he read Jim Douglas's great book, JFK and the Unspeakable. And he realized, wow, there was really, that book just outlines everything about the era and what was going on and how many people in different walks of life hated the Kennedys and were ready to get rid of JFK because of his nuclear, because he was actually having a rapprochement with Cuba and with the Soviet Union. So Bobby started looking into it and finally asked me about it, and I think a few years later, and wanted to know what I knew. So we began to discuss it, and it's not been the main topic of conversation, but I write about it in the Real RFK Jr. as well. His metamorphosis to someone who was very, very who became convinced there were conspiracies in both cases, and there were. I mean,
Without
conspiracies
question.
are real,
Yeah.
and not all the time, but certainly in those two instances, and I think in the case of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X too,
Agreed. Yeah.
there was more than one lone nut assassin that
We've been fed.
were involved. So
One of the issues, folks, I have a problem with is when people call me a conspiracy nut, they think I'm a flat earther, or we never went to the moon, or 9/11 was a government thing, and all this stuff. Nothing could be further from the truth. Once you start investigating these things on your own, hopefully by listening to shows like mine, reading books by Dick and Jesse Ventura, of course, you'll come to know that there are many, many, I call them anomalies, but they're far more than that. They're facts. Sherry Feaster's the CSI crime scene investigator who found a frontal shot using 21st century forensic science techniques that weren't available in 1963. This is for John F. Kennedy's assassination. What's next for you, Dick? We're going to have to start to wrap up now. You
well, I'm
mentioned the
working on
UFO book. Yeah.
yes, and I'm also doing another book. I was featured on the podcast series "Who Killed JFK" that Rob Reiner did with
Yeah.
Soledad.
Talk about that if you wouldn't mind. We got a few
So
minutes.
it was a 10-part series, and it was hugely popular. I mean, more than 9 million downloads. and I ended up playing a role in it as the lead investigator, and so it was fun. It was scripted. We did lines together. Doing lines with Rob Reiner was kind of a kick, and
Did your ramps go to 11?
right.
I'm referring back because I'm a musician, right? So every musician I know has watched Spinal Tap.
Yes, yes, and
Yeah,
now he's
that's what I
done a
was referring
sequel.
to.
It's coming out.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, looking
So,
forward to it.
so out of that came Simon and Schuster with wanting to do a definitive overview book on the assassination of President Kennedy. So I'm working on that with David Hoffman, who was the script writer for the podcast series, and before that, there was going to be Rob wanted to do a feature series, like a feature film
Mhm.
that was going to be based on my work as an investigative journalist, but every studio turned it down, even though the first couple of scripts were terrific, and they were still afraid, to really dive into this and say there was a conspiracy, which there was.
Yeah.
So anyway, we're now working on this book, and then I'm also contracted to do a book on the UFO UAP phenomenon,
Mhm. Mhm.
and I've been fascinated by that for years, and
Me too.
and now it's really big, and the congressional hearings are happening around the fact that yes, military whistleblowers are saying we have uh, recovered not just craft that have crashed from another universe, whatever, but also alien bodies. So that's being put out into the mass consciousness, and I'm going to write about all that in the new book.
Lots coming up. Dick, I'm going to ask you a question I literally ask every person that comes on this show. You're literally talking to every single university student in Canada because this show is syndicated through 200 stations, through the radio stations on university campuses, college campuses, of course, the internet, YouTube, and a bunch of other podcast outlets. What would you say to them?
I would say we're living in tumultuous, scary, but also very important times in terms of people needing to come together, fighting for what is most personal to them, what they believe in, finding out what that is. I wouldn't be hopeless if I were in college today, even though your political persuasion might not be what we have in the country, because there's a lot of work to be done. And, our environment is in bad shape. We've got to fight for that. We've got to fight for the truth to come out about events in the past that they've never been come clean by the government. And another aspect of what's going on now is President Trump says he's going to release the last of the JFK assassination files and the UFO files that have been hidden by the government for many years. So, there's a lot to support in terms of transparency, and I would just say don't give up. Fight for a better world, and us old guys are still, Brent and myself, and a lot of others are still trying to do that too. But it's going to be your turn. So best of luck.
That's perfect. That's a great way to end it. Folks, I'm Brent Holland from The Brent Holland Show. Take care of each other out there. Rough times right now. And it's important that we reach out to those that are hurting more than ever. Take care of yourselves. See you next time.
Thank you, Brent. Good to be with you today.
Thank you very much, Dick.